Here's Jordan Peterson to ramble about meaning.
One of the criticisms that Sam Harris and the atheists in general have levied at thinkers like myself and thinkers, let's say, like Carl Jung.
Oh no, not a postmodern critique.
This is also a postmodern critique, is that the interpretation of a given narrative is arbitrary, that you can read into a narrative anything you want.
Well, if you interpret the narrative as metaphorical, as Peterson routinely does, you can say that the metaphor represents anything.
And that there's no, you might say, intrinsic meaning in the text.
It's not just that there's no intrinsic meaning, it's also that if you are interpreting the meaning as metaphorical, there's no way to know if your interpretation is correct unless the author tells you. If the author's dead, you can only conjecture what the intended meaning is.
Now, that's actually wrong. And we actually know why now, and we can actually demonstrate that it's wrong. And I have no idea what the ultimate significance of that will be, but let me tell you why, because this is really quite fascinating. So we know that some words are more similar than others. And then you might say, well, what makes words or concepts similar? And the answer would be something like substitutability. Mm-hmm. Or you could think about it as, so substitutability with regard to a purpose. It's a very critical and strange definition of similarity, but also proximity in the space of meaning.
That's an unnecessarily complicated way of saying that words can be defined synonymously. This is not a profound revelation. Dictionaries define words with synonyms or synonymous phrases.
And then you might say, well, what does it mean for things to be proximal in the meaning space? And it means likely to co-occur.
What determines the likelihood that any two or more words will co-occur is how people tend to use them. So if you're inferring meaning that way, then you're not pointing to intrinsic meaning, but rather the meaning that is bestowed by use. Words don't inherently co-occur, they only co-occur if people use them in ways that result in co-occurrence.
Now, the student I'm referring to, his name is Victor Swift, by the way, he's been able to show, and this is essentially mathematically, a conceptual overlap between 10 concepts and the concept of God. So imagine this, Bishop Barron, imagine this, that every concept has a center. Okay, so the concept of God, the center of the concept of God would be God. But then imagine that there's a cloud of immediate associations around that concept, and that those associations are the concepts that are statistically most likely to co-occur with that concept. Okay, so this is something approximating a mathematical fact. It has nothing to do with subjective opinion.
It has a lot to do with cultural contingency. What words get used in similar ways as other words, or what words tend to co-occur with other words, is entirely contingent upon time and place. It's contingent upon how humans choose to use the words they do, rather than meaning being inherent to those words. So even if you infer a meaning from a text based on how words statistically tend to be used, there's no guarantee that what the author intended to convey with those words lines up with their statistically most common use. This is especially the case if the author is using those words metaphorically. You can't discern what metaphor an author intends from the statistically most common uses of the words that author has written.
So then you could imagine, and we're trying to map this, that you have God in the center, and then close to that would be the true, the beautiful, and the good. And then there'd be another cloud of associations around that. That would be second order associations. Now, The way a large language model works is that it actually learns those associations at multiple levels of comparison simultaneously. So it actually maps out what you might describe as the semantic space, or the space of meaning.
More specifically, it maps out the space of statistically most common use. It maps out how words tend to be used and thus tend to mean, but that is not the same thing as mapping out any inherent meaning. The meanings of words are still contingent upon their use rather than being inherent.
Now, so this would also imply, this is where it gets so cool. So imagine if we took a cloud of concepts that people universally recognized as good.
There can't possibly be any such concepts because I don't recognize any concept as good. There are concepts that I like and others that I don't, but I don't think good has any meaning in an objective sense.
So you could imagine that you and me and Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins would have a fair amount of agreement on what those goods were. Individual, the dignity of the individual, the idea of the good, the idea of the true, the idea of the beautiful, the idea of upward striving. Okay, now imagine that makes a conceptual cloud.
Mm-hmm.
There's going to be a center of that cloud that constitutes the reason for the similarity of the ideas. And it looks to me like, semantically speaking, so in terms of our verbal content, this might also be true with regards to the stories we tell, that the central concept around which all goods rotate is indistinguishable from the semantic representation of God.
They have something in common in the sense that I can't recognize either as coherent. However, the reason why I don't see good as being a coherent concept is not because good is described as a timeless, spaceless, disembodied mind that created the universe. That's a description of God that seems pretty distinct from the typical description of good.
And it also looks like we can now map that. So I think we can dispense entirely with the criticism that the interpretation of, say, biblical narratives has to be something arbitrary.
What words we choose to convey what ideas is, to at least some degree, arbitrary. If it weren't, then the meanings of words would never change. And if you're trying to interpret any kind of metaphorical meaning behind the Bible, then by definition, the words being used are not necessarily being used in their statistically most common way. If what you intend to convey by using a particular word is something metaphorical, you could be using that word to mean something that nobody has ever used it to mean before. That makes the intended meaning impossible to reliably discern by mere statistical analysis.
And we can also make the case, which Carl Jung made to begin with, is that in any system of value that's coherent, there's going to be a central factor that accounts for its coherence. And it's certainly the case, it's highly probable that that's indistinguishable from the concept of God.
What I value is contingent upon what my conscience tells me. Peterson seems to conflate the conscience with God. He has previously defined God as one's deepest instinct, or words to that effect. If that's the case, then God is an entirely subjective experience rather than a timeless, spaceless creator of the universe.
That's how it looks. And so that's so cool because we're starting to be able to use this technology to dispense with opinion.
No, we're not. You can run a text through a large language model and it will tell you how the words in that text are statistically most likely to be used. But as I said before, that can't tell you what the author intended. Authors commonly use words in ways that are novel or idiosyncratic, and that's especially true of Peterson himself.
So, Jung said, God, called or uncalled, God is present.
Right, God is there.
Now, right. And I don't remember who he derived that from, but that was what he had carved on his castle at Bollingen. But that's the same idea, right? That implicit in a semantic landscape is the central concept of the highest ideal. That's kind of like the summum bonum. So I'm just wondering, what you might be thinking about in relationship to that possibility.
It's hard to square that with the idea of a timeless, spaceless entity that incarnated for the purpose of sacrificing himself to appease himself and let everyone else off the hook for their sins.
Yeah, there's so much there. There's questions of hermeneutics and questions of metaphysics and questions of psychology and that. I'm against the postmoderns who want to unravel the self, first of all. There's no really coherent self that does this judging and analyzing.
There is a self, but it's the activities of the brain rather than a soul. To say that the self is brain activity is not a denial of the existence of a self. Apologists are rarely happy with a concept of the self that doesn't involve some woo-woo magical entity.
There's also, they want to unravel metaphysics. And what you're arguing there in a more sort of semantic way is that there is a coherence to the self, there is a coherence to the metaphysical structure of the real. So to use an example of God, yes, we would say that God is not a being, but being itself.
Well, that would be pantheism. How do you square pantheism with the idea that God is timeless, spaceless, and immaterial? Being itself would incorporate all that exists, including time, space, and matter.
So the famous answer given to Moses, right? Ego sum qui sum. I am who I am. Moses is asking, what kind of being are you? He's trying to put God in categorical terms. And the answer there is so important because that makes all the difference when it comes to understanding religious language. Is if we follow Moses and his question, we will inevitably end up in atheism. Because if you think God is a categorical object in the world, eventually you'll say, well, I don't see this object and there's no evidence for it and I can explain the world without it. So that's why the answer of God in Exodus is so powerful, because he's saying, dumb question, wrong question. I'm not a thing in the world that you can name. I am who I am, which means I'm the prius. That's Augustine's language. I'm prior to thought and to language. I'm prior to being.
Is he being itself, or is he prior to being? How could being itself be prior to being? That doesn't make any sense. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.